This video is brought to you by Skillshare.
January is my least favorite month of the entire year.
Where I live, it's really just a nothing month. Everything is gray and cold and rainy on the worst days. It only snows here about once a year if I'm lucky. There's no color, it's overcast most of the time, and the sad beige of it all really zaps my creativity. So I know there's perhaps only one thing that can save my creative juices this time of year, and that is creating a little guy. Oh my gosh, a little guy. Could that be it? Could that be the key? My serotonin, it's rising already.
This is going to be part of a larger costuming project that I plan on doing in February. Of course, to go along with it, I need the obligatory little guy.
The associated costume is going to be wintry and magical, so I need a similarly wintry and magical little guy to go with this. So for my little familiar, I settled on an Arctic fox kind of little guy, but also inspired in proportions and size by your regular red foxes and also Marvel Arctic foxes, but this time with a much more celestial twist because this little guy is gonna be blue with stars and moons and celestial motifs all over him because I see him as a little forest spirit that takes the form of the fox during the winter to help the forest and critters sleep and whatnot. He may or may not literally be stars or the moon, I don't know. Either way, he's just a little guy.
So typically when I start a sculpture or an art doll like this, I begin with a wire and foil armature because I like to use the trash and what I have on hand. But this time, instead, I've chosen to upgrade and get one of those plastic articulated armatures. I got this one from CR's Crafts, but they had a cat model just for sale, and this was significantly less expensive than investing in the whole kit. And this is pretty much all I need for this project. So I decided to get Meow Meow. And hopefully it'll also keep me from making this thing entirely too big. I have a history.
So since I didn't have to worry about building an armature from scratch, I got right into sculpting the head. But right away I had a bit of a challenge with this particular build because I want to put a bunch of glowing lights and LEDs in a bunch of places, like the head and eyes along the back, maybe through the sides of the body. In order to do this, I wanted to make the sculpt of the head hollow so that I can put LEDs in there after baking. Thankfully, I had this paperweight lying around that was about the right size and shape, so I covered it in aluminum foil to protect the finish and figured I could sculpt on top of that. Once I covered that in foil in a way that was easy to take off for baking, I added another lump of foil to the front of that to build up the snout a little bit, and then I started covering the entire thing in a thin layer of clay. I was trying to do the smart thing for once here and really make sure the head wasn't too heavy, that way it didn't slump down with the weight of the clay. So I'm trying to keep these layers as thin as possible and mostly bulk things out with aluminum foil. I began by detailing the snout a little bit separately before attaching it to the rest of the face. The mouth area was definitely difficult to figure out here since I wanted it to be holding a lantern, and I definitely went through some trial and error to figure that out. Once the join between the snout and the base of the face was a little smoother, I began building up the brow bone and the eye area a little bit, and I also started defining where the eye sockets are going to go. I'm pretty used to drawing and sculpting canine anatomy, but I was a little on the fence about exactly how realistic to make this, so the face here was very much a trial and error process. I slowly added in little details like the corners of the mouth, the sides of the nose, and I also dug the clay out of the eye sockets to give them a more permanent placement. Once all of the foil was cut out with my X-Acto knife, I could clean up the borders of the eye sockets a little bit, add a little bit more definition to the inner corners of the eyes, the bridge of the nose. With the eye cavities cut out, I also did the same for the celestial designs on the forehead because I also want those illuminated by LEDs. And I even sculpted some rough ears for our little guy, but don't worry about those because I ended up ripping them off later. And while I was worried about capturing the glowy eyes in my illustration, I went on a bit of a side tangent to experiment with different eye techniques to try to capture the color and shape and all that. I tried hand coloring an eye design onto the back of some clear mosaic beads, which was a pretty decent effect, but still not quite glowy enough for my purposes here. I also digitally drafted a few different designs, printed them out, and experimented with those a little bit, but even after all of this, the ones I ended up using are, spoiler alert, none of these. I will say the ones that I colored myself with acrylic paint paint pens did look pretty cool. They just weren't what I was going for this particular build. In fact, these proportions in general, while very cute, were not really what I was going for this particular build. The eyes were a little too big, the snout was too small, so I went back into the sculpture and cut down some of the brow bone a little bit. I added some bulk to the snout area and the cheeks. I added a little bit more distance between the eyes and generally made the eye sockets a good bit smaller than they were. I just wasn't feeling the cartoony eyes on this one. But now that I was a lot more happy with the general structure of the head, I could do my favorite part and go in and start adding juicy little details. I added eyelids. I sculpted in a gum line around the mouth and chin area. I added nostrils and started carving out the details of his little snoot. And at this point, my little fox also needed some teeth. So I sculpted a tiny row of bottom teeth to make him look like his mouth is a little bit more open. And then I sculpted some tiny little top and bottom canines, pre-baked those to make them solid, and carefully placed those with some tweezers. This is one of the moments in sculpting that always makes me so nervous. With all that general refining out of the way, I was now able to rub him down with a healthy layer of oil of infant to smooth the clay out and help it hold detail a little bit better. And once some little whisker holes were put in place, I could add a healthy layer of directional fur lines over the entire head. This takes exactly as long as you'd think it would. Fun fact, you're also really not even gonna see this later, but I'm stubborn and I have to do it every time. Also, his little devil nubs are because I fully detailed and added those ears to the sculpture earlier, realized they were gonna make it way too heavy and they were gonna be too fragile, and so I ripped them off, and those are just there to mark where the ears are gonna be later. Anyways, with the head all squared away, the only sculpting left to do was some little hands. And the paws also came with their own healthy set of challenges because I was not about to put plastic in my oven, so I just was not going to sculpt directly onto this armature, but I also needed all of them to fit the armature once they were fully baked. I thought about doing this in a couple of different ways. First, I considered using foil as a base, but then it just was gonna be too bulky and big. I didn't like it. So instead, my second idea was to create some balls. Shape those into little pegs that actually fit on the bottom of the armature, and then pre-bake those so I have something a little bit more solid to sculpt onto, and that was definitely the method to go with. Once my pegs were baked, I added some lumps of clay onto the front to create a sort of dog croc. Okay, I'm not joking. This is a file that I have on my computer. Okay. That I could then cut little toe nubbies into and slowly shape into something that actually resembled paws. From there, I actually decided these were not going to be tall enough for the proportions of the figure, so from there I added another lump of clay on top of that. This would serve as that canine wrist joint sort of thing, and from there I could hollow these nubs out, fit them onto the bottom of the figure. Since all my paw nubs were well shaped, I did a quick little fitting on my armature, and since it was working, I could now start adding obsessive detail to all of the paws, like little toe beans on the bottom. This is like the cutest part of the entire project. Gotta boop the beans for good luck, you know what I'm saying? I also added little tiny toenails to all of the paws. And then of course the final step was to soak them in baby oil and add a thin layer of fur detail that, that's right, you're not even gonna see by the end of this. But at least I know it's there. Also, my humble brag for this project is when I sent a picture of these paws to my partner, he thought they were a 3D print, and I was like, no, I sculpted those, so I'm pretty proud of these babies. Anyways, with all the sculpting finally done, it was time to bake these beans.
Later.
Gotta bake the head, of course.
Minutes later.
I also forgot to mention earlier that the eye method I went with was just nothing. I just put clear little eyeballs in the sculpture so I could decide what to do with them later. And my decision was just color the back of them with some alcohol markers and call it a day. That is all I did. But honestly, with all the different methods that I tried, I think it really does give the best effect with the lighting. Since I ripped off the ears, I of course needed an alternative ear method, so instead I decided to make them out of craft foam to make them a lot lighter. So I drew out a general shape onto some 3mm craft foam and cut them down accordingly to make them fit the shape that I wanted a little bit better. And to give them a little more structure, I took some armature wire and hot glued that to the edges. I'm gonna cover this entire sculpture in faux fur, so I decided to get a head start on the ears to experiment with my methods a little bit. I just traced out a couple of ear triangles for both sides of my foam, shaved them down a little bit with my pet shaver to give them the correct fur length, and hot glued both sides of that to my foam pieces. Once they were glued in place, I went back in with my pet shaver without any of the guards to like really sculpt the ears and get exactly the shape that I was going for. And I also used some fabric tack to join the two seams and make them as clean as I possibly could. Once I was happy with the shape of the ears, I glued them into place on the sculpture, and once I did, our little guy was looking a lot less like a weird gremlin.
Sculpting little guys has certainly helped me brave the winter and boost my serotonin, but you know what else is helping me a lot? My cozy little crochet project. This is gonna be a blanket for my parents. We're getting there. Just gonna take the rest of my life. So this year, I wanna boost my crochet skills a little bit by learning tapestry crochet. Hopefully create a couple little pieces each month in the hopes of making something big out of them by the end of the year. I have honestly had a little bit of a rough start. This is my first attempt. Don't make fun of her, she's sensitive. So to rectify that, this month I took Paige Nicole's class, How to Crochet Any Design Using Tapestry Crochet, and this class is of course available through this video's sponsor, Skillshare. I initially used YouTube videos to help me start learning tapestry crochet, which was super helpful, but Paige's class helped me a lot by slowing down and really showing me step by step, starting with a simple enough design for a total beginner and providing a detailed grid and a written pattern. I think I showed a tremendous amount of improvement here on my second attempt thanks to Paige's class. Like, you can actually tell what it is. But Skillshare has lots of crochet content. If you want to get into textile arts in 2026, you could take Learn How to Crochet for Absolute Beginners with Kat Kemble, to name just one. Here's a bunch of others on screen. But if crochet isn't your thing, Skillshare offers classes on pretty much every single creative topic you can think of. They're taught by world-class creatives like professional illustrators, renowned graphic designers, and successful entrepreneurs. I even have my very own class on my sketchbooking process on Skillshare if you want to check that out. So if you want to come learn from other humans, pick up a new creative skill, learn a new hobby, or just engage in some anti-brain rot, the first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so get started today. Thank you so much as always to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now back to the project. So now that my pieces are all baked, and my little guy has ears, I need to attach this onto my armature, which is unfortunately a little bit easier said than done. In order to get my LEDs in here and make sure they're kind of diffusing properly, this head needs to stay relatively hollow on the inside, give them like just a little bit more space behind the eyes and everything. So I need to attach this hollow head to this nub and leave space inside the head at the same time. How does one do that? This is my silly little solution. I've basically gone in here and added some wire and secured that in place with Warbler. Secured that in place to the actual armature with more wire and Warbler. Now the head kind of can turn a little bit, but it's also nice and solid, like it's not falling off. And I've also secured all the paws in place with some Warbler. So at this point, I don't think any of this is going anywhere, which means I should be able to move on to the next step, bulking out the figure with polyfill and a bunch of Christmas batting that I got on sale after the holidays. This is a cat armature, so I feel like my proportions are a little off from what I want them to be. The head is looking a little bit too big, especially in comparison to like the lower back end of the body. I think I need to focus on bulking this out a little bit, bulk out the chest, and then try to leave the limbs mostly lanky, you know, foxes. They're kind of just cats and wolf clothing. So now that my little guy has a body, before I start sewing and adding actual fur onto him, I need to figure out my lighting situation. I got these LEDs that I'm going to try to string from his head down his back onto his tail. Even though I haven't fully decided on the specific markings yet. So I'm just gonna go ahead and try to generally get these in place with some hot glue so I know where to cut out some of the fur markings and start diffusing everything. Hopefully these will be bright enough. The lighting effects are pretty cool at least. I also need to hide this giant battery pack. So this is my lighting setup right now. I've got one long line of LEDs stretching from inside the head all the way down to the tail and kind of wrapping around the body. That's the ones that are controlled by a remote. RGB, they have this like pulsing kind of setting on right now. Kind of want to make sure the lighting looks like it's a little bit active, almost like it's breathing. And then up by the head, I have two more additional short strings of these warm white LEDs just to light the face up a little bit more. I'm gonna have to figure out some kind of switch access. And then I have two more of those short LED strands on the sides of the body here. I have one more of these on the tail to illuminate that a little bit more. And then all that extends down to this big old battery pack that I'm going to try to hide inside the body here. Maybe have either Velcro or a zipper in the fur down here so I can continue to access this. Haven't decided yet. So next I've got to add fur to my little guy, and I don't have the biggest selection of fur here, unfortunately. I know I have more of this around here somewhere, but I cannot find it. It is glitched off the map. So I hope this is enough. I don't have the largest pieces here, but like, I don't know, we're gonna figure it out. I think I'm going to attach this with a variety of methods. Some of it with this bad boy.
But first things first, to get the individual fur pattern pieces I need, I really just lay my guy out using him as a guide for the size of the piece I need. I draw out a rough pattern shape and cut it out. I cut the main body piece this way and then cut some little holes for all of his legs to go through. Once I did a quick fitting of his new winter coat, I did the same for a tail piece, and I did use my sewing machine to sew this up right sides together so I could flip it back right side out afterwards, and I would have a clean tube of fabric to then slip onto the tail area. With my back piece cut out, it was time to do some shenanigans to get the LEDs to shine through the markings a little easier. I really had no idea how to go about doing this, so I just drew the general markings onto that back pattern piece and cut them out with my scissors. And then I took some Sherpa-like scrap fabric I had lying around, shaved it down as much as I could with my pet shaver while still trying to make it a little bit fuzzy. And then I just took scraps of that and glued it over the open marking holes to diffuse the light a little bit better. This worked pretty well, even though I forgot to get footage of it. So from there, I gave my sculpted bits a base paint of white so I could begin gluing everything on. I initially hand painted this, got lazy, and used a flat enamel spray paint instead. Now that I was prepped to glue the fur on, I did decide the legs were too bulky, so I took a bunch of that batting off, and from there I began the tedious process of adding fur to this entire thing. I way underestimated how long this would take, and for that reason I did use hot glue for the most of it because I could not be bothered to hand sew all of this. I used to hand sew plushies back in the day. I do not miss that process. Anyways, once I got the legs and tail on, I did don a mask because, oh my god, my lungs and all this. It's like owning 12 white cats. But with the legs and tail in place, I could start permanently attaching that body piece in place. I fit the body piece to the stomach and chest area by trimming and fitting as I went, and for this one, I did whip out the needle and thread because I ended up hiding the battery pack in the chest area, so to access it, I did hand sew in a zipper. I wish I had a white one on hand. This beige one is the best I could work with, and hand sewing the zipper into the stomach was super tedious, but also very worth it to access the many battery packs that I had to hide in this guy somehow. With fur on most of the body, it was time to move on to the head and neck. I'll be honest, by this point I was absolutely over hand sewing, so I just used strips of fur and hot glue, and I slowly built up his little mane into a shape that I liked. Once I got closer to the face area, I used Fabri-Tac a lot more to create clean seams and try to reduce bulk. And once I got to the actual face, this is definitely like by far the most nerve-wracking part of the entire project. I slowly and carefully glued on strips of fur and then tinier and tinier pieces of fur, just trying to shave them down and shape them as I go. Try not to put too much bulk on the face. And when I got to the areas of the face that would have the tiniest layer of fur, I got to literally cutting down tiny individual pieces of fur and tacking them into place on the face with my fingers. Like I said, super tedious, super scary, but in the end, I love the result. I'm really happy with how this looks. Thankfully, I don't think it took away from the detail of my face sculpt. So with the hard part out of the way, I donned my pet shaver again and just went in, sculpting all of the fur on the body, especially chopping it down a lot on all of the legs, the sides of his rib cage. I really used the fur a lot to sculpt the masses of the body here, and I think it ended up looking pretty good, even though my proportions are, you know, a little bit more cat than I would have liked. Anyways, regardless, the little guy test was passed with flying colors, and my serotonin is through the roof.
Hi there, it's so cold, but I thought I would come outside, have like a bit of a change of scenery for the little guy update. Here's the little guy update.
I have given birth to a new son.
I'm so happy with how he's coming out so far. He's so huggable. He's pretty poseable, even though my, excessive use of hot glue made him maybe a little stiffer than I would have liked. And look at his face, it's so fuzzy. I do really like the effect of furring the face. I've never done that before, so I was a little iffy about it. I was like really scared that it was going to ruin the sculpture and I'd be able to see any detail, but the method that I researched and used here I think was like really effective. Also, since we are outside and it's dark, let me do something.
My mic did cut out in the middle of this. I was just showing him off in the dark here with all of his glowing lights, which I think look really good. I love how these are coming out. And one of the reasons my mic cut out is my little toasty boy was messing with the tripod out of jealousy. I think he just wanted some attention, even though he did knock down the sculpture. Also, shady behavior from this one. But I did give him some much needed attention, and also attempted to share my thoughts on the upcoming painting process, which are fear. I was very afraid. I was really happy with this and I didn't want to mess it up.
Anyways, like I was trying to say, it's time to paint.
Oh my gosh, it cut out again. The key to this painting process was patience, something that was in short supply at this point, but that was it. I started by layering up some gold on the markings that are supposed to glow with my airbrush, making sure to comb the fur in the direction it's supposed to lay in as I go, and then I could begin adding all the blue coloration first with a light layer of blue, and then slowly adding darker and more saturated layers of blue, specifically highlighting the corners of the markings and anywhere where the fur is longer and thicker. I used a paintbrush for this in some places where the details were difficult to reach with the airbrush, and I used the airbrush in places where I needed lots of coverage and saturated colors. I wanted to build up these gradients slowly to make them look as natural and intentional as possible. So finally, I turned all of my lighting effects on, and I finally went in with the darkest blue color, which was almost black, and I started adding the darkest, most saturated details. I focused this on the ears, on the snout. I further darkened some of the most saturated areas of his fur, and I, of course, completely saturated all of his legs in this darker color. This is where some of that Red Fox color scheme inspiration was coming in. I also darkened the area of his belly where the zipper was to make it blend in a little bit more. And finally, I added all of the little details to his face, both using the airbrush for places like the corners of the eyes and the eye sockets, and I used my paintbrush to blend those colors and also just to get to any areas where the detail was a little bit too risky to use the airbrush. Once the eye sockets were painted, I removed the masking tape to reveal his beautiful glimmering ember eyes. And with most of the general color out of the way, I went back in with my paintbrush to add even more meticulous detail. I used a white color to refine some of his markings and add even more sparkles and stars to his face area. I added a bit more of a beige tone to the white areas of his fur, and he also got some brown and pink tones to his nose, his gums, and I also added a pale yellow to his teeth. I added the same color to his toenails, and finally painted all of those adorable little toe beans. To add a bit more realism for that wet look, I added a thin layer of UV resin on his nose, his teeth and gums, and to the bottom of his paws. And I also used some puffy paint to add a bunch more stars and sparkles to the rest of the body so it matches his face. And just when I thought I was done, I said, hey, that's still not quite enough for me, so I sacrificed a couple of bristles from a paintbrush to serve as whiskers, and I carefully attached those to his snout with some fabric tack. But wait, there's more. You might recall in my design, this fox is holding a little lantern in his mouth, which I have been working on behind the scenes the whole time in secret. I had this little lantern left over from an old project, so I decided to use that as a base. To get my cool designs in the little windows, I laid out super thin sheets of clay and cut them to match the size of the glass. Then, using my sketch as a reference, I carefully laid out 4 different little celestial themed designs and cut them into the clay with my X-Acto knife. This was very difficult because the clay was so thin and fragile, but I think it worked better than using paper or something like that would have. The X-Acto blades I have on hand are not sharp, and I simply didn't feel like dealing with that. Once my windows were done, I gave them a bake and a layer of dark brown paint. I then gave all the glass windows a tone of an orange amber color with some alcohol markers before gluing all my windows into place. I still needed a way for my little fox to hold this, so I chose power tools. I just drilled a little hole on both corners of the mouth so I could slip a piece of wire into it, allowing him to securely hold the lantern, but also make it removable if I want. But obviously this little lantern still was not fancy enough for me, so I took some of these gold metal filigree pieces I had lying around and glued them onto the plain edges of the lantern in a way that made it look a little fancier, a little bit more designed. It wasn't going to completely match my illustration, but I was okay with that. Finally, I gave everything a coat of matte black to age it a little bit, and then dry brushed with the rust color to bring the details back out a little bit more. I also added a few celestial beads hanging off the very bottom for an extra little bit of zest, and once those were painted to match the rest, my celestial little familiar was finished, which means it's time for the reveal. During my outro, my mic cut out again. Anyways, I'm really happy with how this little guy came out. If you want to see the related costume for this fella, that should be coming out next month, so subscribe if you want to. If you feel so inclined, please leave a like for the almighty algorithm and tell the video it's pretty in the comments because it needs those kinds of affirmations. But as always, thank you so much for watching. But the biggest thank you for this video and every single one of my videos goes to my patrons. And if you want to become a patron and support my work here, I am now releasing monthly exclusive sketchbook sessions on Patreon. Link will be in the description. You can access those sessions at all paid tiers. But as always, the biggest thank you for this video goes to my executive producers: APW Mix, Awendu, Agent Sketchy, Eileen, Alfred Nightingale, Away, Band Off the Yellow, Bean the Bread, Benjamin Asuna, Breeza, Cinderus, Cardia X, Cloud Max, Cyrus Orion, Dodo, Donna Shipley, Doomsday Outlaw, Eloquent Silence, Ermler Jean, Bambadil, Fiasco, Freedom and Gus Gus, Ghastly, Gravity Drop, Heebie Jeebies, Hesta Boone, Hypnos, I Hang Out with Cats at Parties, I'm not saying that name on the internet, I do TKD, Jenny Kraspa, Christina Kimtia Art, Liana, Lovisa, Luxabar, Mushroom Sita, My Name is A, Mystic, Nylode Nam, PNG Not Found, Puddinghead, Queen Wintersby, Ren, Scribbles, Sharky Types, Speak of the Devil, Stabby Horse, Sweet Winter Garden, Silver, Thea Maia, This is Exhausting, Turotu, Two Prism, and Veli Smelly.